Hi, and welcome to the show. Subscribe at kevinmd.com/podcast. Today, we welcome Heidi Sykora. She's a nurse practitioner, and today's Kevin MD article is The Case for Regulating, Not Banning, Kratom. Heidi, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
All right, so before talking about your article, just briefly share your story and journey.
Well, I'm a retired nurse practitioner and healthcare executive, and most of my career was really focused on developing clinical guidelines and programs, as well as, of course, seeing patients. And typically, I would tend to see the most vulnerable patients, especially geriatric oncology patients. And so actually, I got my master's the year before you started your journey in your publication. So I've been following you for a long time. So it's a real honor to be here.
All right, thank you so much for sharing your perspective. And today we're going to talk about Kratom, which we've talked about on Kevin MD and on this podcast before. Tell us what your latest article is about. It's titled The Case for Regulating, Not Banning Kratom.
Well, I think it's really important that people understand, especially policymakers and also healthcare providers, the difference between kratom and a substance called 7-OH. And these have been conflated in media reports, in the literature, and they're very different. So that was my main objective of the article, is to make it very clear that kratom is a natural plant that's been used safely for centuries. And it is actually complex. It has over 40 different alkaloids in it. I believe they've identified even 50 now. And the primary alkaloid is called mitragynine, and that makes up about 60% of the plant. And it is a partial mu opioid agonist, but it also acts on multiple other receptors. It has some dopaminergic, some adrenergic, and some serotonergic activity as well. So in low doses, it has a stimulating effect, kind of like coffee, but in the higher doses, it can be effective for pain relief. The problem has been that recently a new substance called 7-OH has come onto the market. It's a semisynthetic substance that they actually use really strong chemicals to draw out this trace metabolite of mitragynine called 7-hydroxymitragynine or mitragynine. And so in the natural form, that's not a problem at all because it's in such small amounts that as it metabolizes through the liver, mitragynine breaks down into 7-hydroxymitragynine, but it really is so small it doesn't cause a problem. However, when you bypass that system and you make that 7-hydroxymitragynine into pill form or, whatever form it might come in, then it really is a very strong opioid-like substance, and it has more of a potential for harm. So that is the big difference. And so that was my concern. And, I saw a lot of, articles that were conflating the two. They're two totally different substances as far as what you get in retail sales.
So tell me, for patients, when they see Kratom advertised in their drugstore or grocery store, tell us the type of formulations that are currently available, and typically what do patients look to Kratom to treat?
Mhm. So a really large study was done by John Hopkins, and it showed that people are using it mostly for pain control, and that's like, I can't remember the exact percentage for pain control, but pain control, opioid withdrawal symptoms. And that's really important because the natural kratom plant does not lead to respiratory depression. So it's a much safer option for people than, getting illicit opioids or any other illicit drug that they can use the actual kratom plant to help with their withdrawal symptoms. So PTSD is another reason a lot of the veterans have seen benefit for that using kratom plant, and anxiety depression are some of the other reasons.
And in terms of the available formulations that patients can just buy from a
Mhm.
drug or grocery store, what are they typically composed of?
So I think, the closer you are to the natural plant, the longer the history we have of safe use and the more we know about it. So the people can purchase natural kratom plant powder. And the most important thing is to make sure that it is a manufacturer that is following the what we call the Kratom Consumer Protection Act that has been passed in 18 states. Hopefully, it will be passed in all 50 states very soon. But that requires, first of all, age greater than 21, that the products are manufactured or packaged using good manufacturing practices, that they're lab tested. And I think that's really important. Consumers should be able to go on the manufacturer's website and see a certificate of analysis that shows that there's no adulterants, that the alkaloid levels are in line with the natural plant, and that there's no heavy metals, et cetera. So let's see, labeling. Of course, it should be appropriately labeled with the ingredients, with the serving size. And I think I might be missing something, but that's the general Kratom Consumer Protection Act, or KCPA. So that's in my opinion, that's the safest way that consumers can get that. You can order it online. There are many smoke shops that also carry kratom products. Now, the farther away you get from the natural plant, the less we know. And of course, the more safety concerns, come into play. From the natural plant, there are full spectrum extracts. So basically, they use food grade solvents and they just extract the fiber out. And it's a very fibrous plant. So, you know, most of the most of the powder itself is actually fiber. And so those full spectrum extracts, again, they're reflecting the natural balance of that plant. So the safety profile on those are very good. Now, there's concentrated extracts. And so for those, now you're extracting more of the mitragynine and increasing that level. So that is going to be stronger and have more of a, safety concern, especially for those who have problems with addiction, because that can lead, to, more problems for people who do have, those kind of concerns. And then, of course, we go all the way to the semi-synthetic and synthetic substances, which, to me, in my opinion, those are drugs. Those, I think, should go through the new drug application.
And are those clearly labeled? So if a patient goes to a smoke shop or a drugstore and look for kratom, is it clearly labeled which is more directly a derivative from the natural plant versus something that is more metrogynine or even synthetic? Is that obvious to consumers?
Not necessarily. It definitely takes some education. And this is why reasonable regulation is so important. This should have been done years ago. Unfortunately, the FDA in 2016, attempted to ban, but natural kratom leaf and mitragynine specifically, they do not meet the criteria for, for scheduling per the 8-factor analysis. And so that's why kratom was not scheduled. However, they did not accept it as a new dietary ingredient either. So it lies in this kind of, no man's land, basically. And regulation is really what is needed to make sure that, consumers really know what they're getting. Now, the American Kratom Association, they developed the Kratom Consumer Protection Act and the Good Manufacturing Practices program. So they have vendors on their website that have met those criteria. It's not perfect. So, but at least it's a start. And those states that have the Kratom Consumer Protection Act, it limits, that's the most important thing that I forgot to say, is that the Kratom Consumer Protection Act limits the level of 7-OH in any Kratom product. So for the states that have the KCPA, those products really should be in line with, with safety and much safer for consumers. Enforcement is a whole different issue, though. So some of the KCPA states have 7-OH products on the shelf. Well, their Kratom Consumer Protection Act should avoid, or at least give them the authority to enforce that and take those products off the shelves.
So there's been cases that we've heard in mainstream media, people using kratom that's linked to liver injury. The FDA has issued warnings about kratom and some serious risks about it. So what form of kratom are these referring to, or are they just throwing everything under the bus of a single label when the reality is more nuanced than that?
Reality is definitely more nuanced, and there's been a lot of bias against natural products, of course. And, part of that is, the unknown. But for kratom, there is just plenty of clinical studies on it. There are case reports that seem to be magnified, and that's typically what you're hearing. And there's like, one or two case reports that are not, that have a lot of confounding variables and don't even collect the product. So just because someone says I took kratom doesn't necessarily mean, that they took natural whole leaf kratom. It could be anything that they're calling kratom. So I think that that's an important distinction. So, for example, the kratom reported deaths, almost all of those have been due to poly drug use or some other underlying factor. And but if kratom is a co-ingested substance, it seems like the media focuses on the kratom instead of the cocaine or the, methamphetamine or, whatever else was in their system. And of course, toxicology reports are another conundrum because sometimes if kratom is found, or somebody is known to have taken kratom, they only test for mitragynine.
Mhm.
So they don't test for any other, substances. We found those cases as well. So it really does take the, details to understand what the real truth is. And so it's been real eye-opening for me to see the disingenuous article titles and sometimes the articles themselves that just really don't meet the standard that I would expect.
So what would you like to see? Because I know that there are some states that just ban kratom entirely. When you say that you want kratom to be regulated, specifically in your ideal world, what would that look like?
Well, I think federal regulation would be ideal. So a federal Kratom Consumer Protection Act. And I think that would really protect access for all the people, millions of people who benefit from kratom, and also put some safety net around it to make sure that youth are not getting it, that's 21 and up, that any, alkaloid level is not able to be altered, increased, concentrated, et cetera. And, I'd like to see it be sold in more nutrition stores, with people who can do some education rather than, the current, smoke shop,
Hmm.
format that we have. So I think that that would be the most ideal thing.
And the Kratom Consumer Protection Act, tell us exactly what's included in that.
So the Kratom Consumer Protection Act is common sense regulation that limits the level of 7-OH in any product to less than 2% of the total alkaloid level or 1 milligram per serving. It requires product preparation with good manufacturing practices, lab testing of all products to ensure purity, restricts sales to those over 21 and older, and proper labeling.
We're talking to Heidi Sykora. She's a nurse practitioner. Today's Kevin MD article is The Case for Regulating, Not Banning, Kratom. Heidi, let's have some take-home messages they want to leave with the Kevin MD audience.
7-OH is not kratom. 7-OH is a semisynthetic drug. The natural kratom plant has been used safely for centuries. Let's not throw out the baby with the bathwater. The FDA has recommended a ban on 7-OH, and they made it very clear that they are not targeting the natural kratom plant.
Heidi, thank you so much for sharing your perspective and insight. Thanks again for coming on the show.
Thanks.